Subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button. Click the bell button and enjoy the latest uploads from our channel.
A rallying cry of the progressive left is to not normalize Donald Trump, and to stay vigilant in rejecting his lies, cruelty, and affronts to the institutions that define the U.S. system of government. Trump, they argue, is a unique threat to American democracy. This school of thought, call it normcore politics, is supported by the recent work of several prominent political scientists, who argue that Trump's defiance of the cultural rules and agreements, or norms, that we all follow should be front and center in this era. Democracies erode slowly, in barely visible steps these days, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt write in How Democracies Die, cautioning Americans not to be complacent merely because there are tanks in the streets. They rot from the inside thanks to demagogic leaders who subvert the very process that brought them to power. Trump, in many respects, fits this bill. Earlier this summer, Trump began tearing children from their parents' arms to throw them in cages, insisting the step was necessary to avoid an infestation of asylum seekers from south of the border. He backed away from portions of that policy, only to tweet that in the future deportations should be carried out without judges or court cases, a chilling reminder of the consistent, multi-front threat posed to the rule of law by a president who's undertaking a partisan purge of the FBI. But identifying the threat too closely with Trump is ahistorical and myopic in ways that lead to analytic failure. Norms have been eroding in the United States, but the erosion began long before the rise of Trump and simply can't be explained by him alone. This is not to argue for complacency toward Trump's leadership. His misdeeds, corruption and cruel policies deserve to be confronted and fought. But the danger of normcore politics is excessive complacency about post-Trump America. A politics that is narrowly anti-Trump and excessively focused on norms runs a substantial risk of finding itself paralyzed and unable to govern even if it wins. There was no democratic golden age. The failings of normcore politics start with a somewhat blinkered and romantic view of American history which, as Ezra Klein recently argued in his review of much of the democratic crisis literature, is actually quite ugly. The country was founded on the brutal genocide and dispossession of its native population, relied on chattel slavery as a cornerstone of its economic development, fought a deadly civil war, had the outcome of that war challenged by a largely successful campaign of terrorist violence, and by the 1940s was locking up the Japanese-American population in internment camps. The good news is that America's founding documents and principles have always served as a kind of guiding star to which activists and advocates could attach themselves as they push for reform. But not only was the civil rights revolution of the 1960s fiercely contested, in the streets as well as in the courts and the legislatures, its partial victory more or less set in motion the ever-increasing ideological polarization of our parties and the growing dysfunction of our political institutions. This history is, of course, not denied by the proponents of normcore politics. But it tends to get downplayed in the campaign to portray Trump as a form of unique evil, necessarily placing a nostalgic cloak over the past. The political theorist Corey Robin wrote an entertaining piece for Harper's focused on the specific historical amnesia of Philip Roth, who over the course of the decades proclaimed first Nixon-era politics, then Reagan-era politics, then Trump-era politics as each historically awful and far worse than what had come before. While back in the 1970s he had unfavorably compared Nixon to Joe McCarthy. In reality, as Robin observes, it's never the immediate present, no matter how bad, that gets normalized, it's the not-so-distant past. When George W. Bush was president and Ronald Reagan passed away, liberal magazines like The Washington Monthly produced articles on Reagan's liberal legacy in part as a way of slamming Bush. These days, Bush enjoys soaring approval ratings, thanks to the comparison to Trump. These nostalgia-soaked takes generally do manage to capture something correct about both the past and the present. but the tendency to idealize the past blinds us to the profound ways that political struggles connect across time and reveal fundamental clashes of interests and values and not just the particularities of a given moment or personality. The era of constitutional hardball in the winter of 2008-09, Barack Obama swept into office under the premise that the man he displaced was a kind of unique horror,